United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And I'll entertain a motion for tonight's agenda.
Move to approve as presented.
I second.
The agenda has been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. All right, that's going to bring us into OSBA training, Robert's Rules of Order with Leslie Fisher.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Hi, Leslie. Good evening.
Did you hear us on your end?
Hi, is everyone ready to get started?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I'm Leslie Fisher from Oregon School Boards Association. I'm a policy specialist in our policy department. I'm also a member of the National Association of Parliamentarians and studying to become registered with them. So I'm just here tonight to share with you some basic parliamentary procedure. And we'll first start with, and anyone just stop me, or I'll have some opportunity for questions as we go along, but initially we'll just jump right in. It's a little bit hard for me to see everyone. How many of there are you there tonight?
All five.
We have 5 board members, our superintendent, and our board secretary.
Are we gonna have an opportunity for questions? Because I can't hear anything from you guys.
Give us 1 second.
Just tell us when you can hear us. Can you give us like a thumbs up when you can hear us? I have to keep asking that question, don't
We're just getting to a good story.
I? Yeah.
But you're there, but I can't hear you. Okay, well, we'll just get started and hopefully we'll have some chat questions pop up if anything. Okay, so why do we have parliamentary procedure? So we want to maintain some orderly conduct for meetings. We want to make sure that everyone gets heard, so that the group can fully consider the actions that are presented to them or the business that you're going to be talking about. Having basic parliamentary procedure also creates some consistency with your rules, and it creates an opportunity for the majority to decide while the minority is still being heard. So I want to give you just a brief look at some of the resources that are available from OSBA. We're covering some of what's in our Guide to Parliamentary Procedure today. We also have a Board's Chair's Guide, Boardsmanship for Oregon School Board members, and public meetings, board meetings and executive sessions. So these are just a few of the free resources that we have available to anyone in the OSBA portal, and I've given you a link to that at the top of that slide. This presentation is going to be forwarded to Chris tomorrow, so it'll be available to you upon request from Chris. So while parliamentary procedure, there's several different parliamentary procedure books out there. One that we base this presentation off is Robert's Rules. But while we want to follow those rules, they're not the master of everything that's happening. So we want to just use them as a guide to help manage governance and create some more effective meetings. So with being able to do that, there's 6 meeting principles that we want to talk about. The first one being the majority has the right to decide, and the minority has the right to be heard. So we're talking about making sure that during discussion time that there's equal amount of time made available to both sides of the discussion, whether opposed or for, so it allows for time to, questions to be asked, information to be shared, because we want to make sure that everyone's making good decisions with some good information. The third principle, like we just briefly covered, members have a right to information to help them make decisions. So during those discussions, or you're considering a motion and during your debate period, that's a good time to request for more information, ask questions during that discussion period to make sure that you have sufficient enough information to make an informed decision. So we'll talk a little bit more later about how that happens during discussion. Many times it's just a request for information. Sometimes it's even a motion to postpone a vote to a later time so that you can gain or get additional information to help make that informed decision. So fourth principle is courtesy and respect during those meetings. So many times there are situations where you might need to interrupt someone. So there is rules to utilize to make that possible. Sometimes we call it a point of order. Sometimes it can be an appeal after a point of order has been ruled on by the chair. But these rules, again, are meant to help maintain effective meetings that are courteous and respectful of everyone's time and points of view. So one of what I want to just talk to you real quickly is because we've just talked on what that point of order looks like. I've got a short video that I hope is going to be somewhat beneficial for you. So I'm going to bring that over to your window here. And it's just a short couple minute video about this group of FBLA kids that really demonstrate what that point of order and appeal would look like if you needed to use it during a discussion period. Oops. Doesn't look like we're gonna have, sound like we're gonna have enough sound. Okay. Well, I guess we're gonna not be able to watch our neat little video, so I apologize for that. So with a point of order during discussion, you can interrupt, and I wanted you to see it in action because point of orders need to be very, very timely, and they're meant to interrupt a speaker when it's necessary. And then in those situations, the board chair is going to be ruling on that point of order. So once that chair rules on that point of order, there is an opportunity for that person who raised that point of order to appeal. And then we're going to go into another process that we'll talk some more about later. So just to reiterate about points of order and appeals, they need to be timely, they need to be raised before the next item is taken up. So that means before, during discussion and before a final vote is called on a specific motion, these points of orders or appeals need to be raised before you get beyond completion of your discussion. So the principle, all members have equal rights, privileges, and opportunities. So how does this happen in a board meeting? So what we want to do is make sure that every board member who wishes to speak can and is allowed at least once per member before a member that has already spoken gets a second opportunity. Many times, some boards establish a time limit. Sometimes that could be 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Larger groups, many times you're going to see 10 minutes, but recommendation is 5 minutes, but as a board, you need to decide what that looks like in your meetings. And we're going to go using a timer if that's ever, if you've got a really long agenda, you really need to stick to your timelines. Establish up front what your time limits are going to be if that becomes an issue. So this is a good way of tracking during those discussion periods, making sure that everyone, that each member gets to speak, so the chair can use this as a checklist. The secretary, the board secretary can use this as a checklist. If you're working next to each other, so you can help keep track of what's happening. This creates that equity and being able to, anyone who wants to be able to speak during that time. And if this is kind of what it looks like, then you might have one of these for each agenda item or each, or specifically for your consent agenda. Just really something to help you keep track who's spoken, who hasn't. Maybe during discussion, one of the board members deferred to another one, or they just didn't have any comments to say. But at least you're giving them that opportunity, checking off that you did. And then once you're done with that first round of comments or allowing each member to speak, then you can come back to this list. And if anyone raises a request to speak again, then this just keeps track of that information. So members also have a right to an efficient meeting. So what does that mean? So stick to the agenda as much as possible. Discuss one subject at a time. Any remarks about a specific item on the agenda need to be germane to that agenda. So this is an opportunity that if someone's getting off topic, this is a good point of order opportunity. Another way to have efficient meetings is to use a consent agenda. So if you don't use one now, consider using one of those. I have a slide later in the presentation that would help. If you don't use one now, you're going to be able to understand why it and how it could be used. Another way is when you are taking votes or you're choosing to talk about or finish up on a specific item, sometimes unanimous consent can be helpful. So the chair is going to say, are there any objections? Pause, hearing none. And I want to mention that silence means consent. So if you have an objection, you need to raise that objection before the chair makes the ruling on whatever is being considered at that time. So we talked about
So Leslie, can you hear me?
If we go back to this one, we said remarks must be germane when we're talking about subjects. So they need to be relevant. If a member, if someone is off topic, the chair or a member may raise a point of order.
Log into the Zoom.
So we talked about that just a little bit ago. So if you're in the middle of discussion and one of the members is going off topic, they're not providing germane or relevant comments to what is on the table, the motion that's on the table or the question, someone can call out point of order. So in this case, the chair needs to rule on that point of order. Once that ruling is made, if the member maintains its relevance, so they're appealing that decision, then the chair needs to ask the group to decide. And when you're thinking about this, remember, you're deciding if you agree with the member who has raised the point of order, not the person who was talking and maybe may not or have been providing you with some germane comments. It's the person that raised that point of order that you're going to now vote on. The chair has ruled that it's not germane. They've accepted that point of order, but the member, I'm going to go back to this one, the member maintains that their comments are relevant. So the chair says, okay, let's ask the group. All those who believe these remarks are not germane say aye. And all those who believe that they are say no. And then whatever those results are, then you move on to the next stage. So any questions so far? I guess if you do have questions, can you put them in the chat?
I had a question
I
about
see a hand,
unanimous consent.
but I still can't hear what's happening
Yeah.
on your end.
Can you hear me at all, Leslie? Leslie, how about now? Nope. Are you speaking?
Put it in the chat. Ask you to check our speakers, and then tell her to go on to the YouTube.
Do you want me just to continue? Because it's... Does anyone have an opportunity to type in the chat and let me know?
I can't see what I'm typing.
Okay. So before we start talking about the motions, because the next stage would be just managing those items on your agenda. So why did we do motions at all? Well, we talked about motions create the list of business that your group is going to be discussing. So main motions propose an idea. They should generally always be put in writing, be clear and unambiguous. We recommend that they're grammatically positive, so when you're writing those, speak in a positive way. And then comply with other rules and procedural law of the land. So a motion is only in order when no other business is pending. So many times you're already discussing items. So like we said before, one subject at a time. Finish one before you move on to the next. So other general rules of debate. Maintain fairness. No interrupting unless out of order, such as breaking a rule or violating decorum. Be courteous and respectful. Use neutral terms. I believe and here's an example, I believe there is strong evidence that the member is mistaken. So we don't want to use words like lie or misinformed. Let's try and keep those neutral terms when raising your concerns. Members address remarks to the chair and generally need to stay on point. We talked about that a lot. Stay on point. Keep your comments relevant to what you're discussing on your agenda, and use that point of order if that seems to be getting off track. I'm just responding to your chat, just one sec. can anyone just speak out for me, just so we can test this?
Yeah, can you hear us, Leslie?
Perfect.
There we go.
Sorry, so did anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question about unanimous consent. So
Say that
you,
one more time.
I had a question about unanimous consent.
Yes.
You talked about the idea of unanimous consent. Can you be more specific about what you mean by that, or what that looks like, or give an example? Are you talking specifically about consent agenda or any agenda item? Okay,
Okay,
you got it? So my question was unanimous consent. Are you talking specifically about consent agenda or any agenda item? And can you give me an example of what that looks like?
sure. Any agenda item. So, and I am gonna cover that again in a little bit later in the presentation.
So are you saying that it wouldn't require a specific vote if there was a perception of unanimous consent? Or how does that, I'm trying to understand how that specifically works, and I'd be happy to wait until you're gonna
Okay.
answer that question.
Sure, so, if there's an opportunity where the board chair can shorten the voting process, the board chair can, if you're just about to vote on something, or, the board chair can say, I'm gonna probably want to go to let me see if I can just show you really quick. Yeah, let's try and get to it in the presentation,
Okay.
because it's not popping right up out of it.
Okay, that's fine. And I just want to make sure that we do cover that before we're done. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so we already talked about the other general rules of debate. So, we like to just talk about these Robert's 8 steps that create that process to handle each agenda item. And many times, during debate, we're gonna find some other steps that we can look at. But generally, the chair resides and applies the rules of the group during this process. So what we'll start with is so you have your first agenda item up, you have your motion is read, and that second step is needing that second. And you can second that whether or not you want to discuss or argue against that motion. So here's an opportunity. So if the chair doesn't hear a second, but they should at least say, is there a second? Having heard no second, they're going to move on to that next agenda item. So wanting to make sure that that opportunity is provided, and the main motion isn't going to go any further unless there is a second. So the chair can state the motion is lost for want of a second, or the board chair can also second that motion if they have a feeling that they still want that to go into discussion. So in that third step, let's say, again, this is another option of wording. In the absence of a motion or a second, we will move on to the next item on our agenda. Assuming that a motion has been seconded, there's a couple key points just to point out. The maker of the motion can change the motion before it's restated by the chair, and the seconder, who originally seconded, can withdraw their second. This is pretty rare, but just a couple key points to remember. So if neither of those things occur, the chair needs to restate that motion just to provide clarity and understanding about what you're talking about. So the chair can say it has properly been moved and seconded, that, or two, and restate that motion. And once that's happened and it's been, the chair identifies it as being properly moved and seconded, it now belongs to the body. So now you're in step 4, debate, and this is also the opportunity to amend that original motion. So during debate or discussion, here's the opportunity for the chair to use that checklist and make sure that you are providing those opportunities for each of the members to speak and provide their comments during that discussion period. And remembering to allow each of them to speak at least once before you move on to another one. The maker cannot speak in opposition of the motion. They're the ones, the maker of the motion. So they brought it before the body of the board, so that shouldn't be, their speech should be in favor of that motion. So the next person to speak is generally the motion seconder and can speak either way. They don't have to be, they can be opposed or for that original main motion. So continue through the remaining board members for comment. Use that checklist, and if everyone has had an opportunity or someone deferred, then you can go back through if anyone needs further discussion. This is also the opportunity to request for more information, make other motions in here that we'll talk about briefly. Remember to keep your comments and amendments germane to the original main motion. So this is an opportunity. So we're in step 4 and you're in debate and you have an opportunity for amending. But let's say no amendments come through, but discussion seems like it's just dragging. So one member, at least one member, can call for question and vote. So that's going to stop the debate and call for the vote. So this type of motion needs a second. It can't be debated. It can't be amended. And it generally takes a 2/3 vote to pass. So that's not a majority. It's a 2/3 vote because you are limiting some rights and privileges of the board members. So you're cutting off that discussion. So it requires a 2/3 vote. Generally, that is a 4 vote in the affirmative of a 5-member board. Any questions so far?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So step 5. So let's say that vote to end the debate passes, or there isn't that particular vote, but it just comes to a close and the chair says, is there any further discussion? And then they can pause, allow that time for someone to speak up if they need to, and seeing none, so the chair can say, seeing none, we shall proceed to vote. So the chair needs to restate that motion again, so it's clear what you're all voting on, and then call for the vote. So before that vote happens, a member should declare their potential or actual conflicts of interest. If it's a potential, they should still vote, and they should state that potential, or state that there is a potential conflict and may still vote. A member choosing to abstain, there's some dialogue here that they should call out. Chair, I will abstain from voting because, and state your actual conflict of interest. So the chair can then call for the vote. Those in favor of the motion say aye. Those opposed say no. So we don't use nay. We want to make sure that we're using aye for yes and no for no. And the chair can call out their vote or vote with the rest of the body. So in step 7, the chair is stating the result of that vote, whether it passed or failed. And if it passed, the chair should state what will happen as a result of that vote. So again, restating that motion, whether it passed or failed, and if it passed, what was that motion that was on the table that passed. Once that's done, then you're moving on to your next item. So, questions so far? Okay. So I just want to go over, we talked about the 6 principles. We talked a little bit about what key points of debate need to happen. So what does that look like in motion? So main motion gets a second, you start discussion and debate. Let's say there's no amendments and nobody raises any other motions to postpone. You have a vote, and that's, if it's yes, you're taking action. If it's not, it's failed. So let's say that there is a motion, you're in debate, and someone presents a motion to amend. That motion gets a second. You discuss what that amendment is. And we're not discussing what the original motion is. We're just talking about the motion to amend. And once that debate finishes, you're voting on that amendment. So if that amendment passes, or fails, sorry, you're going to go back and vote again on your original motion. Not vote again, but vote, because you haven't yet, because at some point someone submitted a motion to amend. So if that vote passes, then that amendment goes back to discussion. The chair can call for a vote, and now that chair is going to be restating that motion as amended. So now you have the amended motion, and you're going to be voting on that new, and I don't want to say new, I want to say amended motion. So let's say the original motion got through discussion, there wasn't any amendments, but someone made a motion to postpone. We're going to talk about motions to postpone in a little bit. Someone seconds it, so you need to get it to a vote. So motions to postpone end up moving that discussion generally to a new meeting. So if it passes, it's going to a new meeting. If it doesn't, the body needs to reconsider that original motion. So when we're talking about amendments, why do we do these? We amend a motion to improve it. Those amendments need to be germane and relevant to the original motion. They require a second and a majority vote to pass. And I know I'm giving you a lot of content on here, but remember, you're going to get this slide deck. It's debatable to what is in the amendment, and any member can offer an amendment. It can be debated if the main motion is debatable. So there is times when the main motion isn't, that an amendment wouldn't be. But that's really getting into the weeds. So, again, requires a second and a majority vote to pass. So why do you do amendments, or ways to do specific amendments? Add or insert words, strike out words from the original motion, strike out and add or insert words, and substitute. You can substitute an entire section of a sentence if you need to. So there's several different ways to do it. What you want to remember, some fine points about amendments, is that you need to finish each of those amendments that you're making and vote on it before you can move back to the main motion. So if there's your first amendment, I'm going to call it a primary amendment, you need to vote on that motion before you can vote on the main motion. There's also an opportunity for a secondary amendment. So I move to amend the amendment by, so then going back to those options that you have for making amendments, you're inserting words, striking words, replacing words. Those are your options there. So then, again, you now have a second amendment before the group that you need to debate and vote on before you can vote on the main motion. No more than two amendments can be made to a main motion, but you cannot amend a secondary amendment. You do not need to go or look to the original maker or the seconder of the main motion to ask them if they agree. They're going to be voting right alongside you when you're voting on either the primary amendment or the secondary amendment. Any questions so far? Okay. So, let's say you have an item on your agenda that's before you. You have a motion, you have a second. The chair has restated the motion, and it's now open for discussion and debate. You start your discussion, and one of your speakers that you were expecting earlier during the meeting has finally arrived, and you need to stop and allow them to speak because they were originally before some other earlier time on the agenda, or they came because they're going to speak to another item of business. You can table the motion that's before you, and that's just a temporary. A tabling motion should not be used to move or postpone an agenda item, to a different meeting. We're going to use a postpone motion in that sense. But to just table a motion that you're currently in the middle of, but you need to stop and take up other business, or a speaker that just arrived, you can, any member can motion to table. It requires a second, it can't be debated, and it's not amendable. And you need a majority vote to table that agenda item. So again, it's not to be used to postpone to another meeting, and it can't be used to kill a motion. So and one other caveat to that table is, or that tabling motion, is if it's not stated by the motion maker why they're tabling that motion, the chair can ask, for what purpose does the member seek to table the motion? So, you tabled your motion, your guest speaker arrived, and you've taken up another form of business that you needed to handle with that speaker, and that business has concluded. You need to come back to that motion that you tabled. And that requires a motion to take from the table. So it's returning to business previously tabled in the same meeting. It needs a second. It's not debatable, it's not amendable, and it needs a majority vote. Unfortunately, the motion dies if it is not removed from the table. So we prefer that this is not the way that you do to actually try to kill a motion, although it effectively does that if it doesn't come back from the table. If this motion passes to take that item from the table, then the chair again needs to restate that motion to acknowledge that original business that needs to be taken up again. So here's another option for during discussion, if one of the members can propose a motion to postpone definitely. Let's not get that confused with indefinitely. So this is a definite postponement to a specific, and this can be to a specific time on the same agenda or a next meeting. And generally, it should be used to postpone an agenda item of business to a next meeting. And the reason might be to, maybe there isn't enough information. And so when a member is proposing a postpone definitely, you should also explain why. And maybe it's that the coordinator for the project is not present at the meeting, and you would like to be able to bring them back to the next meeting to answer questions, provide more information. That would be a good reason for using motion to postpone, definitely. Needs a second. It has limited debate only on the merits of that postponement. It needs a majority vote to pass, and it's amendable because of the time. Where is it going to go? Is it going to the next meeting? Is it going to go later in the agenda? And it needs, again, I already said that, but it needs a majority vote to pass. So here's what that might look like. I move that we postpone the motion to replace the playground equipment until the next meeting to hear from the project coordinator. Or because of the lateness of the hour. So maybe it's getting really late in the meeting, it's the last agenda item or the second to last, and it's just too late. That is another reason why you can use a postponement. So another delaying or disposing of a motion is refer to committee. So this is another motion that can be brought up during debate, refer to committee. So a motion to refer to committee, and that motion should specify, or at least have enough information. What committee is it going to? When do you want that committee to report back to the board? And whether that committee has the power to decide the matter and move forward, or is that committee expected to make a recommendation to the board? So those are some 3 key points that you want to include in that motion. That motion requires a second. It has limited debate on merits of the refer to committee only. It's amendable, and it requires a majority vote. So most of your voting on is going to come or be resolved with a majority vote. So more than half. There is a few instances where a 2/3 vote is required. Anytime you're suspending rules, limiting these, or extending the limits of debate. So we talked about that briefly. If someone's calling for the question to end discussion and call for a vote, that requires a 2/3 vote. And in a 5-member board, that's generally, it's going to be 4. Always encouraging the chair to call for a show of hands when voice vote is unclear. Before we run out of time, I want to just real quickly try and find my note about the I just lost all that. Apologize. So I want to get back to your earlier question before we lose some time here. About the unanimous consent. So if a vote is presented, and it kind of goes along with chair stating there's a motion before the board. Is there any objections to the motion on the floor or on the table? And if there is no objections raised, then the chair can say, hearing no objections, the motion passes. Sometimes that is used for, right here, sometimes that can be used for adjourning, so the motion to adjourn at the end of your meeting. If there are no objections, the meeting will adjourn, and that's another way of stating it. If there are no objections, the motion will pass. And so it avoids taking that vote because your silence is consent. So you need to raise an objection if you object to that form of unanimous consent, so that brings the chair back to calling for the vote and obtaining that vote process. So, couple privileged motions, adjourn, requires a second, it's not debatable, it's not amendable, it requires a majority vote. Anyone can present that motion to adjourn. And then a motion to recess. So this should be used when you're leaving your regular session to an executive session, or maybe you need to take a break during a meeting and reset. This could be for a variety of reasons. You need to put up the presentation. There is maybe some discussion is getting heated and you want to reset what's happening to come back, take a 15-minute break and come back to your discussion. A recess is used for that, so make sure you're not using an adjourn when you are leaving your regular session to an executive session or needing to reset that meeting. Use the recess. And it requires a majority vote. So, real briefly, this last one is postpone indefinitely. So use that if your intent is to kill a motion. It doesn't mean it's going to pass, because it still requires a vote. It requires a second. It's debatable. It's not amendable, but it requires a majority vote to pass. Other motions that are unclassified, so they're not a subsidiary, they're not a main motion, they're not an incidental motion, they're just unclassified. Reconsidering, I'm not going to go into detail on this one, but I'm going to be providing you with the slide, so it's going to have these points on it. There's also to reconsider and enter in minutes. This is another form of reconsidering. And then to rescind or amend. So those are motions available to you as the governing body. And there's some points that I provided for you. So the consent agenda, if you don't use one, do you use one?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so I'm not going to touch on that then. This will just be included, reasons why they're so helpful, maintaining some of those efficiency needs for effective meetings. So does anyone have any other questions? Did I cover that part about your unanimous consent you had a question about?
No, I think I got it.
Okay. Did anyone have any specific questions about motion process or any of the motions that I presented that you want me to cover a little more?
Can you hear me? It's Roger.
Mhm.
I gotta ask. Is there a conflict when a item, like a contract, if we're advised by council, requires a vote? but procedurally, you're using the consent agenda and/or then just unanimous consent, where there was never an actual vote?
Actually, there is a vote when you're using the consent agenda, because you still need to vote in favor of that consent agenda. So if there's a consent agenda item before you, there is still a motion to approve the consent agenda or adopt it, and there still is a vote. So that if that consent agenda contains a list of contracts, and many districts do that, they put the list of contracts that need to be approved on that consent agenda. And so you are essentially voting on that consent agenda. And then, because it's part of that agenda, the board has voted on it.
But the practical reality, as you described it earlier, is that if no member asks for an item on the consent agenda to be pulled, the chair just declares that the consent agenda passes.
You can, if there's, so the chair, if the chair uses that unanimous consent, and they say, is there any objections to adopting the consent agenda? If there's no objections, your silence is consent. So then the chair would state, hearing no objections, the consent agenda is adopted or passed. Does that make sense?
Would a motion have to have been made to adopt previous?
A motion to adopt the
consent agenda.
The consent agenda.
Yes.
I think if the chair reads it, the chair should be stating the motion anyway. So the motion to approve the consent agenda. Are there any objections to approving the consent agenda? If there are no objections, then and if there's silence, then it's adopted. I think it's always a good idea to state the motion that's before the board and then follow it up with, if there are no objections to approving the consent agenda, then it goes forward. So, because again, if no one objects, so someone can object to that and say, call for a vote, and the chair then needs to call for the vote and do the normal vote process. If that unanimous consent process is not favorable in your board meetings, then make that as a rule that that's not going to be something that your board chair uses. Just always use the vote.
So again, this is Roger. So as you describe it, there could be $100 million worth of contracts inside a consent agenda, and as a matter of process, they never got voted on, other than somebody's silence.
Well, if your silence is consent. So if you, again, if you don't want to conduct your business with unanimous consent, with that unanimous consent process, then talk amongst yourselves as a board and make that decision so that the chair understands that they should just always call for a vote on every motion. That you guys decide how that's going to happen, and if there's an instance where that comes up and the board chair is using that option for unanimous consent, object if that is not what you expect to happen. Object to it and call for the vote. Because anything on that consent agenda is getting adopted on. or voted on. It's all one motion. So we're coming up just a few minutes before 7.
Hi Leslie, this is Eric. Yeah, between you and Vincent Adams' class on board chair responsibilities, this was pretty good training. Thank you for being here tonight. I did have a question on a point of order.
Mhm.
So who can actually call a point of order during a meeting? Audience members, all participating staff, voting members?
So, yeah, so board members, the public is not capable of calling a point of order. It is not their meeting. It is the board's meeting held in public. And then the other situation you have is if the board allows it, and we recommend that you do, to allow staff to call those points of order also.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yep. Anyone else? Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to email them to me. You can find my information on my email on the website. I'm under the Policy Services Department, or I'm lfisher@osba.org. And again, I'll shoot this off to Chris tomorrow, and you can request a copy of this from her, use it as a point of contact. I'll be sending, in addition to this, it's kind of a table that outlines all the different motions. It tells you whether they're debatable, limited, what type of motion they are, what kind of vote you need, which generally is always going to be a majority vote. But all of that will get to Chris so she can deliver that out to you guys when you need it.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for having me.
Thanks.
All right, it's gonna bring us to board goals, letter E. Does everyone have a printout or a copy in front of them?
No.
Chris, I brought paper copies. Would you mind making some copies?
So just your background, I know that the board's talked about board goals a couple of different times. I think it's come before you. And I think that at the 7/21 regular board meeting, there was a list that was put together, suggestions, I know at least from Director Nyquist and Director Thompson. And there's kind of a summary. And then, I think Chris has attempted to put together a list of what she heard from that and summarize those in a way that would catch what the discussion was like on the part of the board, and then also what suggestions were put together. And I think there's at least one thing that's been added to that, which is the very last bullet on the set there. And so when she comes in with that, I'll see what it says. But just for now, it says select and hire a permanent superintendent through a transparent hiring process. So for one of the things that the board needs to do this year is to hire a permanent superintendent. And so it makes sense to me that would be one of your big goals for the year, and adding that to the list. I might use some other superlatives like super high quality, wonderful superintendent or something like that, but it probably just needs to be as simple as what it says.
And Mr. Superintendent, we talked about a little bit of difference between board goals and district goals.
Right. Yeah, so when I look at this list, it's kind of interesting because I think my opinion has changed on what this list is a little bit, quite honestly. When I look at this list, I think it is an appropriate set of board goals or goals for the board, right? I mean, these would be the things that you all want to accomplish over the course of the 21-22 school year. And so things like hire a permanent superintendent is certainly one of them, or ensure every student has an individual path to academic excellence, provide a safe and welcoming environment for all students and staff. I mean, these are all things that I think would be appropriate. Actually, probably district goals or board goals, and having those be similar would be important. So my thought is that when Chris comes in with a list, you can take a look at them, read through them, see if you think we're where we need to be, and or if you think that there are some modifications that still need to be made. We can have some discussion about that, and at some point in time, bring those back and have you all adopt them would be where we want to go with that, but not obviously until they get to the place that you like them and are satisfied with them, so. There we go.
And so I think we should start kind of making a big list, and we can narrow it down. So you gentlemen would be okay with, let's say, our top 10, and then we whittle it down if needed. So I would like to start us with number 1 on hiring a superintendent, a permanent superintendent.
Yeah, I could agree with that. I mean, I think that's gonna be job 1 for what we need to take on.
Correct.
I just listened to a course on how to object, and Mr. Chair, I object, or I do not concur. While it is important and we have to do it, I just think, based on where we've been the last couple of years with COVID and shutdowns and restarts and remote learning, that the most important priority and goal is making sure kids get caught up to where they are, to where they need to be per grade.
And in all reality, we are going to hire a new superintendent. We're going to work on that extensively. But you are correct on what our actual core goal should be. We're hiring a superintendent, as you stated, is more of our job than our vision.
So I'm writing these things down, and so I wrote it down pretty much verbatim for what you said, Director Nyquist. I didn't know if it seemed like nobody said no on that. Any discussion or thoughts about that one? Is that something, we're not making decisions here tonight, obviously, but in general, that seems like a good one that people would like to have on the list? Okay.
Yeah, we can discuss the order, but I think that should be on the list.
Okay, great. Got it.
I also think important is track and develop outcomes of student and staff success.
Okay.
So I have another one, and that is that we take all possible and appropriate steps to make sure that kids have a positive social experience for this school year. In the hustle and bustle, just to get schools open and trying to avoid substantial quarantines. Just the day-to-day stuff can be a real challenge, but one of the things that really, another thing kids were robbed of over the last 2 years were all those extracurricular activities that help develop them, that help them develop as people. And so if there are financial resources or other accommodations that need to be made to make sure they're getting those opportunities that they haven't gotten, that is really, really important to me at least.
A segue to that is to help us all get back to normal, to find ways to have normal interactions, normal activities that we used to enjoy before we all had to cover our faces. And I know there's some limitations to do that, but to strive to get those things implemented when we can.
I really like the bullet of continue to enhance and expand relationships with our communities, families, and staff, providing community engagement, opportunities, and developing community, business, and organizational partnerships. Anyone else? Mr. Thompson?
No, these are all good. I don't think this needs to be we could go on and on. I mean, I see it as a 4 or 5
Yeah. I agree.
kind of list, and I think we've hit the broad themes that
Yeah,
make sense.
yeah. I think Roger really touched on it. Going outdoor school is a big deal for a lot of students, and we've had 2 years of no outdoor school now, and while it's a fun event, there's a lot of science and education that goes into that, and team building and leadership as well. And that's just one thing that comes to mind while we're trying to figure out what education we lost. Dr. Morris?
I think it looks great. We got lots of things on here, and I think they're all good. I think we're focusing on the important ones, so I'm good.
So just to make sure, right, because I know that Chris and I need to go back and work on this a little bit more and put these together and bring them back for your consideration at some point, or further discussion and consideration, depending. So there's some other ones on there. Continue to learn about, implement, support diversity was one. Same around, continue to support and implement mental health services, provide safe and welcoming environment for students and staff, and ensure students have individual past academic success. I didn't hear those, but I assume that those are still on there. I just want to be clear.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely.
I do have a question, and I've asked before, and we hadn't been able to quite get there yet, is to get some definitions as to what diversity, equity, inclusion are when it comes to the school system, and how those would be. I mean, you gave a definition of equity during your interview, which is the first definition I've heard that I truly agreed with. And so I'd like to, get some other definitions down so I can understand what it is we're aiming at and what we're trying for, and so that would also help everyone be able to go in the same direction.
Got it.
All right, is there any more discussion on board goals? We will move on to F. This is our working agreements.
And were those hard copies for that also, Nate? Copies of those? Okay, excellent, I love it. So, if you all would permit me. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So just in looking at the board agreements, this is a list of agreements that I think was put together 3 or 4 years ago. And 3 years ago. 3 years ago. I think when you had an interim superintendent last. And, I'm sure that as we start to go, my thought is that we would look at these and we could get, general agreement or maybe some disagreement depending on what the topic is. And I guess what I would think might be a good way to go through them would be to go kind of one by one. And if there's agreement, then that'd be great. If there's some wordsmithing, we could do that too. And again, we're not voting, and so it's a general idea that there seems to be general agreement or whatever, enough that there's enough assent, I guess, that Chris and I think we can do a little bit of work and bring it back, right, for eventual approval. And that, you know, in some ways, you treat those as if, okay, we got that one's gonna come back probably, or this next one. And if there are some that there's a lot of debate or disagreement or discussion about, that, you know, we could actually bypass. We could say, okay, we got some more work to do there, let's bypass that one and move on to the next. And see how we go until we get some, you know, sort of TA, if you will, some sort of agreement on those. And so, and that way, I think we could get down to what we need to bring back and what we need to work on and so forth. And, because there's a bunch of them here, right? And it actually is, in my mind, it's 3 different sets of things. One of them is board working agreements, which is what board members would do. Then there's board superintendent working agreements, which is your expectations of the superintendent. And then there's superintendent's expectations of the board. And if you tally those all up, there's, you know, 44, I think. My quick math tells me that. I could be off by 1 or 2. But I think there's 44 of those, it's a bunch, right? So, if we could, maybe, Mr. Chair, you could sort of ask about these and we could just march along.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we're going to start with a board working agreement with number 1. I'll entertain any discussion.
What's using common language refer to?
I'd be so disappointed if somebody didn't ask that. I didn't know either. I mean, I sort of read that and thought, I wonder precisely what.
First I go to English and then after that I'm lost, so.
Do we have common language about what common language means, I think is really your question. So, my sense is that it means using language that everybody understands, or plain language.
Simple words, not
education-ese.
Not 4 syllables.
In ways that maybe somebody gets it, but the broader community probably, or maybe, you know, people who are professional educators or who are on boards get it, but others don't.
Okay.
I think that's what it means.
Mm-hmm.
If I say IEP and, you know, MTR and all that kind of stuff, or MTSS,
So a bunch of acronyms that just shuts down, yeah.
nobody really knows.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to number 2.
I have a concern with retreats. I like y'all, but I don't know that I like y'all that much.
Individual.
More seriously, I don't know how you do a retreat without bumping up against at least the perception of public meetings laws requirement. And my thought is that we won't have any trouble communicating with each other over time. We might not always agree on things, but I would be cautious about anything, a majority of us meeting outside of a public meeting.
So your thought is that we strike the words "and retreats"?
Yes.
Okay.
And moving on to number 3.
Not so much a prison, I think this is a good item. I admit myself, avoid falling into problem-solving discussions is a difficult one, and I'm just acknowledging that probably shouldn't, but I've got to watch that. I want to keep it. I want to keep that idea that we focus on quote-unquote end results, but I'm just acknowledging it gets difficult.
Okay.
Number 4.
Well, 4 is a little bit difficult in that others means an entire community, right? And to be able to know what other people are going to read into questions. I don't know, it's a challenge. Best way to do that's not ask any questions, I guess, but I don't think that's where we want to go.
So Director Nyquist, what do you recommend here? Are you saying that we should not do we should cross out number 4, or is there something, about it that could be changed?
If I'm trying to wordsmith this thing,
Mm-hmm.
I'm eliminating the words "and consider the implications others may read into those questions." If we're vigorously discussing an issue, there may be times that some question is perceived not as intended, but we should have that vigorous conversation on important issues without being real worried about how it's interpreted, right? I mean,
Yeah, so the part about be aware of the words and tone of questions is good,
Right.
but the next part isn't. And then, anything about the rest of it?
no,
Okay.
it's fine.
Anyone else?
No, that works.
Okay.
Number 5. Number 5 is pretty simple.
Yeah.
Number 6.
I guess the question is, what's timely? It depends upon the length of the report, the amount of information that's in there, how much time you need to digest it. Timely could be the morning of, or it could be 4 or 5 days before, if you're looking at a big budget report, you wanna try to digest and try to manage everything else. So I don't know if there's a way to quantify what timely is, but it's a bit subjective.
Yeah, I disagree. I mean, I completely agree, especially like a big budget item, but in general, how we kind of define what timely is when it comes to like the board packet and so on.
So the general is that, we would have the board information to you by, the Wednesday before the board meeting. And that, as you know, sometimes doesn't always happen, for various reasons, but, we get the information into the board packet, for you in board book to be able to see by Wednesday. And then if it is delayed, I would notify you that, hey, these are the things that are not in there, so that you know that you need to go back in and review them, and then I just notify you as soon as they are in them. But our ultimate goal is to at least have the weekend, so that you always have that weekend before, so.
So, like, for example, I know today, there were a couple of things that we changed after it came out yesterday, just because we looked at them and said, that could be better. Or maybe we got a call and somebody said, this could be better, right? And so,
Yeah.
there's a couple of changes that can happen on a Thursday or Friday. We like to have the bulk of it ready on Wednesday, and then very few changes on Thursday and Friday. And if it's about big, hopefully that meets the intent of what this says. So I don't know if that works or not, and certainly the idea that something bigger, like a budget document prior to a board budget meeting or something like that makes sense.
Yeah, we tried to back it up further, it's just a big domino all the way back.
Oh, sure.
So, we backed it up one more day, because it used to be Thursday, so we backed it up one more day to at least give.
And we'll actually go into that on the board superintendent working agreement number 10. We'll cover more of the board packet reports. But while we're on it, on that report, the superintendent's report, sometimes it has a whole presentation. And it comes to a surprise to the board because it's never published in the board packet. So sometimes we're learning on the fly as it goes. I don't mind if you have like a speech or data input for us, but if there's a presentation with a lot of a lot of things that we wanna slowly intake. Those are nice.
Okay. So I just wanna make sure I'm clear. So, a lot of times, like I'll just kind of give a report out on, hey, these are the schools that I visited, here's some stuff that's going on in the district. That's okay, but if I was gonna say, and oh, by the way, here's a report on student achievement, that actually ought to be an agenda item,
Correct.
not stuck into the superintendent's report unless it was published as a section of the superintendent. I mean, really, what I just gave as an example, should always be an agenda item. But if there was something, you know, akin to that, it wouldn't be just given in the superintendent's report, it would be laid out in advance so that you could see it, or it would be a separate report.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Number 6. And number 7. So this one, we do try to ask questions ahead. As you know, questions will always arise during the meeting, but it is important to follow up with those questions. Number 8.
Yeah. So it seems like I should add something to the board's expectations of the superintendent would be to follow up.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
I find it, when we're talking about number 8, I always find it best to communicate directly to the board chair, the superintendent, and the board secretary. I try not to get into the weeds and go to department heads very often.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you could strike the or appropriate person. You know, I think if you added, you know, Chris Green, and I agree, and then allow them to disseminate to whomever they feel could provide the answer. I think that's appropriate.
So, Chris makes me smart once in a while, and she says actually in policy, it says go to the superintendent. But,
Questions through superintendent.
Yeah, but maybe a courtesy copy to you just because,
right, and yes, I wrote or board secretary online, but that's not what policy maybe says, but I honestly feel like it's our office, maybe it should say office of the
so
superintendent.
it's usually right hand, there's no doubt about it.
But,
Yeah.
and left.
And
ours.
Oh, yeah.
But, okay, we'll mess with this one a little bit.
Thank you, sir.
Perfect, thank you.
Number 9.
How do you determine when it's gonna meet that criteria? Because sometimes you may know, sometimes you won't know what's involved in a question.
Yeah, you know, my definition on this, because I've seen this a lot of different, you know, in different places and so on, but my definition of it is always, if the question that's being asked is gonna provide a big enough answer that the whole board should know, then the whole thing ought to go out to the board as opposed to just one person who thought to ask it. And especially if it's gonna, you know, take some time or whatever. And that could be either formal or informal. It could be, and here's the information, or it could be, and this really ought to be a presentation at a board meeting, and so let's do it there. I know your question is what's big enough to be big, right?
Yeah, how big is big?
Yeah. I don't know the definition of that. I would say, you know, it's gonna take 3 or 4 hours of time, how's that?
Well, and I suppose we'll just have to rely on someone to give us some feedback and go, hey, that's gonna be a big deal, we should probably make sure that the whole board wants to do that, and that's reasonable.
I really hate this one though, and this has been used against board members when you ask the cost of, what is our annual cost of OSBA? And if a superintendent doesn't want to answer, they can say, well, the whole board, you have to ask that through the whole board.
Okay. That seems like that wouldn't take a long time to find the answer. But to that one in particular, so, right, maybe it would, not that I'm aware of, but it seems like what we're really talking about here is something that would take quite a bit of time.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't mean that it can't be an item on the next agenda to discuss obtaining that information. So, I mean, it delays it, but if it's important, we'll get to it. So, we'll just have to that's a tough one.
You know, I would like to see somewhere in there, if it's denied by the superintendent, the board chair will be notified that it's denied because it needs to go to the whole board for a vote.
I think that's reasonable. Just be made aware of the fact that we're not gonna seek that information that's too big, or whatever the reason, yeah.
Superintendent,
Yes.
so question for you, what kind, I mean, obviously we can go through you for all the information, but sometimes there's, you know, like, I was asking for our contact information, you know, I'm not trying to put anyone in a bad spot. On the other hand, it's like, I'm just asking for contact information, you know? Is that something we should always go through you for?
Yes, it is, and it just is because it just keeps it really simple. If that's all it is, you know, it takes me 2 seconds to get it done, or I ask Chris to do it.
Okay.
And that way, you know, it just keeps lines really clean.
Easy enough.
Thanks, though.
Number 10. Number 11.
I have a concern with executive sessions in general. In a perfect world, everyone would respect the confidentiality of executive sessions. That's all balanced with the public's right to know. Ultimately, everything we do is the public's business. And so, I don't know how to get to where I think the intent of this agenda item 11 is in the working agreement, and it practically be implemented, balanced with the public's right to know what we're doing. So, one thought is, instead of the period there that ends that, and maybe it's a comma, and it's something along the lines, with the understanding that a majority of the board may vote to release executive session information when it's timely and in the public's best interest.
Would you say with a majority board vote?
Majority, or would you go 2/3? Is
Okay,
that something that would require a greater threshold? Just a question. I mean, because I was struck with,
The ORS probably spells out,
Pretty clear.
just a majority, I don't know.
ORS is pretty clear on what is executive session and what is confidential.
So
What it takes to release.
but kind of the question I have is the or what of this? Because there's no or what. Or what's the consequences if you don't keep it confidential? There's no,
It depends on what you didn't keep confidential.
I guess.
And how the rest of the board would view that, and it's again, balance number 11 with the public's right to know what we're doing on their behalf. And there are times where information and decisions or guidance needs to be confidential, and there's a point in time that it doesn't anymore, depending on the nature of the subject and the decisions. So the fewer executive sessions we have, the fewer times it's an issue. But for me at least, that one needs some more thought and some work than what's stated there.
So it's us kind of talking about this, but I know that at least maybe a few people are watching and listening too, so I just want to give an example of something. Like, let's say that we had a piece of real property for sale, and we went into executive session under that ORS. So I think there are 6 reasons.
I happen to have them here.
There you go.
It would be E, to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to negotiate real property transactions.
Right. So let's say that we went into that, we were in executive session for that, and there was a discussion, and we said, we take $995,000 for that property, right? And there's a discussion, how much money would we need to get in order to sell this property? And that's what the board has a discussion about, not a decision made, but it's generally understood that that's about what it would take. Does that sound right? Okay. And so that's generally decided that that's what it would take, and then somebody comes in and offers you $1.5 million for the property. We would eventually go out into open session, and there would be a vote to either accept or reject the offer of $1.5 million. If we accepted that, that would be the public's view of the decision. But what they wouldn't then know is that, well, we would have accepted 995, and you, a person who offered us that much, that's a knock upside the head of how silly you were for offering us 1.5 million. So there's sort of this place there where I completely agree with what you're saying, the public's right to know and the eventual decision and or what happens there, but there are pieces of it that are funky too, right? Like what I just talked about, for example.
All right, so we're just engaging, and I'm going to attempt engaging on that. You've been doing this longer than I have, so I'm guys in it over my head. So my experience is kind of, there is some sensitivity around property transactions, but it's the opposite. So the district would decide to sell a piece of property when they deemed they no longer had a need for it, and the smart financial move would be to get rid of it, and so they announce that they're interested in selling this property, and you can make offers up until Friday at noon, and you get offers. I don't know that those offers would need to be opened in executive session. They could be opened in public session, and if it was not clear to the board then clearly could ask the team to analyze those and come back in a week and we make a decision. And so that way, in that case, nobody paid $500,000 more than they ever would have contemplated. The flip side of that is if we're buying a piece of property, we need a piece of property, and we're going to begin negotiating for it. And to me, that's more along the lines of needing the executive session, because my experience is there are members in the public, believe it or not, that buy property that they anticipate government entities are going to want, and then they try to sell it to the government entity for twice the money. And so,
I agree that your example is way more accurate and probable in mine completely. So it's a good example.
So I guess the challenge is how how do we wean these executive sessions down to the most absolute necessary items?
That's kind of what my question was, is just because something is covered by executive session, do we need to use that authority every time? And there, like you said, there's some exemptions of personnel and contracts.
Okay, so, maybe what we do with this one is that we take a shot I heard you really clearly, wean executive sessions to a minimum, which I think is one of the working agreements of this board, it sounds like to me. And then there probably ought to be a little more language, and I'll take a really close look at the ORS in order to try to get that right and do some individual thinking about that on my end to see what we can get to, and we'll run this back up the flagpole. Okay?
Great.
Number 12.
There's any real need for discussion on that one, it's pretty.
Yeah. It's gonna move us to the board superintendent working agreement.
Can we, before you move on?
Yes, sir.
I would hope that all of these agreements before us are aspirational, and they are our goals, and that we all make good faith efforts to do these things, but that we not get into an adversarial dialogue if one member thinks another member is tripped up on any of these specific items. I mean, maybe over time, if it's reoccurring, board members can talk to each other individually or through the superintendent.
They shouldn't be used punitively.
Well, it should be litigated. I think that's what you're saying.
Right.
Good faith is the key.
Right.
Key phrase there. Yeah.
I'm hearing that as like a 13th or something like that.
13th or a preamble.
Okay.
Or preamble, I think would be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, good faith working agreement, or.
I wonder it makes me wonder if there were any others that we didn't get on here that we should ask that question.
Chair Robin, I just got a text requesting if we could, when you say the number, if you could actually read aloud the agreement as they're being discussed.
Sure.
I'm just excited someone's listening to us.
All right, moving on to the board working agreement. Nope, we're done with that. Moving on to the board superintendent working agreement. This is the board's expectations of the superintendent. And number 1, work toward becoming a team with board members. Number 2, respect and acknowledge the board's role in setting policy and overseeing the performance of the superintendent.
Number 2 flies in the face of current board policy. I had a 17-point correction that I addressed the previous board with. And one of these was that the superintendent now sets board policy. Agenda. And there were some other things on there as well. So there may be some review needed for section B. Don't have to do that now, but just saying that there's a possible conflict there.
Sure, so this is the document we're working on now.
Yep.
And then we can request through pre-planning to change policy. Number 3, work with the board to establish a clear vision for the school district. Number 4, prepare preliminary goals and annually for the board's considerations. Number 5, provide data to the board members so that data-driven decisions can be made. Number 6, possess a working knowledge of all legal and local policies. Number 7, inform the board of all critical information, including relevant events, anticipated adverse media coverage, or critical external or internal change. Number 8, distribute appropriate information to all board members. Number 9, communicate with the board members promptly and efficiently. Number 10, distribute the board agenda by Wednesday prior to the regularly scheduled board meeting on Monday of the following week, except when major holidays fall on Friday.
So what happens when major holidays fall on Fridays?
We've always gone on the Wednesdays.
Okay.
Okay, so just X that out then? Except when major holidays fall on Friday? If Wednesday's the goal.
Seems like it.
Number 11, respect the confidentiality requirement of board meeting and executive sessions. Number 12,
So on 11, I'm assuming that's the same discussion as we had prior.
yes, sir.
And so I'll work on that one too.
Treat all board members professionally. Number 13, communicate to the board chair if a problem or issue is observed developing with an individual board member. Number 14, conduct a self-assessment prior to the board's evaluation of the superintendent job performance. Number 15, represent the school district by being visible in the community. Number 16, provide follow-up information to the board members on concerns and issues they have referred to the superintendent. Close the communication loop.
So I think that one actually follows the one that you had asked about, Chair Arnova. Perfect. Any that we're missing?
I just kind of want to put in 16 that acknowledge the superintendent is the board's technical advisor in the beginning of that sentence. That's out of the OSBA, right?
Okay.
Gentlemen, anything else on that document?
No, some of these points, I think, contemplate a permanent superintendent, but already in these, I've checked off, Superintendent Saxon's already done most of these already, so, I mean, he'll continue to do them, but he's already.
I was smiling as I was reading him under my mask because I was like, he's actually doing a really good job.
Oh, your communication has been wonderful, Rob, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm probably driving you all crazy with constant communication, but, you know, my goal is to make sure that you get things before you hear it at the supermarket, and I think I might have jumped the gun on that actually today on one, but I was pleased to be able to take it back.
Absolutely.
So, and just in case anybody is wondering, those communications are individual. I never send them out in a mass blast because I want to make sure that there's no feedback that then can be construed as debate. The preliminary goals, I kind of wrote a set of goals, or put together a set of goals I've talked about several times. I don't think we've done anything official with that, but now that I see some of what your board goals are, I can, hopefully put something together that's more concise.
Moving on to the superintendent expectations of the board. Recognize the superintendent as an educational leader of the school district. Number 2, willingness to share the success and failures of the school system with the superintendent. Number 3, assist in gaining acceptance and support of the community. Number 4, willingness to obey by its own rules, policies, and code of ethical conduct. Number 5, willingness within budget constraints to provide superintendent with adequate staff and clerical assistance. Number 7, willingness to acknowledge and follow the chain of command of the school district. Number 7, respect the confidentiality requirement of the board meeting and executive sessions.
I'll work on that one.
Thank you. Number 8, avoidance of seeking personal privilege. Number 9, a willingness to participate in professional development activities at the local, state, and national level. Number 10, an effort to foster unity, harmony, and open communication with the board. Number 11, an understanding of the relative or complementary role of the superintendent and the board in policy making. Number 12, careful consideration of each recommendation by the superintendent. Yeah, I would, on number 12, I would tack on and staff on the end of that, because we have a lot of very professional advisors. Number 13, insist on all available facts and data before making decisions. Number 14, willingness to study and evaluate educational issues affecting the school district. Number 15, practice of avoiding surprise items at the board meetings. And number 16, integrity of the highest order.
Superintendent Saxton, question for you?
Yes.
So, and this is just my communication issue that I have, and I'm fine with going through everything for you, but if they want a question of us, does it also go through you, or can they come directly to us? And I just don't want to break the rule. You know, really is what this is about.
Yeah, I understand. So, you know, it's I guess to me, the dividing line on this is direction.
Okay.
So, I think it's really important, just so that the district runs like it ought to, that the superintendent directs what happens in the district. And so, I think that there would be plenty of times when a staff member might have a question of you that you could answer, whatever it happens to be. But if it was going to direct them to do something, then it should come through me.
Sure.
So you know, the fear of every superintendent, right, is that I had a board member once who went to football practice and started wanting to direct a couple things that the head coach was going to do, for example. And that wasn't very popular, if you can imagine, on the part of the football coach. And so I got that very quickly, right? And then, you know, you're circling back around to try to say, actually, you don't need to run that play unless you want to. And so that's been a long time ago, by the way. But it's one of those that sort of sticks in your head. And so that's, to me, the dividing line on that. And you all are community members. You're out in the community a lot. You're at schools. You're at school events and that kind of thing. People are going to come talk to you, and you're going to have conversations with them. The dividing line for me is that you wouldn't direct staff. And maybe we write that, you know, clearly here. That the board would not direct staff. That's the job of the superintendent.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Yeah, that's always been what I thought, you know, but but also, I think I have to recognize that even asking for things at times, I need to ask through you, even though I might think it's very simple. That's the proper way to do it.
So the other part is, you know, on my end, I'm going to say to staff, don't get directed by the board.
Right.
Right, if a board member asks you for something, let me know, and I'll talk to the board member and say, hey, make sure to run it through me in the nicest, most, you know, wonderful way that I can possibly think of, and then, you know, give them direction on what needs to happen from whatever the discussion is about. So it's a little bit of both, because don't mistake, right? A lot of times it's about a staff person wanting something that maybe I might not, right? Or, you know, sort of you can get an end run kind of thing, and I actually haven't experienced that a lot from our staff, but it's possible, and so there's a couple different pieces to it.
Not on topic, but just to tell you, I've got a lot of positive feedback from the fact that you're out in the schools, and the teachers and staff and even the kids really love that. So,
And how often do you get to meet the vice president?
The vice president, right?
It's, no, it's, he thinks, they think.
Or
he's-
the president, excuse me, yeah, the ex-vice president. Pardon me, you blew it.
He was the vice president.
Yes.
And part of it is just, like mutual respect. I got a request for a West Albany High School newspaper interview today. And I responded with the young gentleman that, yeah, I can help you with that. But I also CC'd Mr. Saxon and Ms. Osborne, just to let them know, like, hey, yeah, a board member isn't interacting. Just common courtesy, I guess.
Right, appreciated it. All right,
All right, gentlemen. That is it for these documents, and we'll see them coming up in a board meeting soon, sure.
Mr. Chair, before you adjourn, I do have an additional item if you don't have anything else. Is there more on our agenda?
No, sir.
So I appreciated the presentation on the Robert's Rules of Order and those technical things. For me at least, I think it's important that anytime there's an item that involves money, or there's a contract that binds future boards, that it should be a standalone item and it should be voted on. We may be in a situation, I guess, where we could be procedurally correct, but certainly not meeting the spirit or the expectations of the public in the way of transparency and openness. And the other thing about moving it to a standalone item is there's a better chance that we will have some dialogue or discussion about that item. I think it'll make us a better board. I think the public will appreciate the additional discussion and disclosure.
I too have a problem with consent agreements. I think they should be brought up. And you can package things together, but they should at least be enumerated on what you're voting on and then have a positive vote as opposed to a silence is a vote of consent. Just the way I look at things. It's just more affirmative and there's less question.
So what I'm hearing is in future board packets is to eliminate the consent agenda and just line item those material.
I would prefer, and there could be times where you package three things together and say, we could vote on this contract, and this contract. Does anyone wish to pull one out? And if no, then you can say, okay, now we can vote on it. So you could shortcut it a little bit, but at least enumerate what we're voting on. We're voting on a classified contract or a staff contract or whatever it happens to be in.
Sure.
And just so that people are aware of what we're doing.
Does anyone have opposition?
so just really quickly, I popped up our upcoming board agenda, and on consent agenda, there are three things. I just want to make sure I understand.
This
that.
is good.
Yeah.
So one of them is personnel classified, and I didn't look at it, but I will real quickly. And I'm assuming, yeah, it's a list of new hires that are classified hires. And then we have personnel certified. I think it's the same thing. It's a list of licensed staff that would be newly hired. And then there's, the third one is a big SEA reclassification MOU. I'm just looking at those. That one is a more specific reclassification of a subpopulation of some of our classified staff. So I look at like those three. They're listed: personnel classified, personnel certified, and classified MOU. And then a lot of times in consent agenda, we also have minutes from this board meeting, this board meeting, this board meeting. So I just want to, like, with that as an example, what would the expectation be?
So the spirit of mine is that the first two are more operational in nature. You gotta hire people. Their wages have already been set and negotiated, and so I wouldn't have a problem with those being in a consent agenda. But the third item, which is a bit of a restructuring, and there are financial consequences with doing that, I take it, is something that I would prefer to be standalone and that we could discuss and vote. And I don't have a problem with minutes being
Okay,
inside consent agenda, as long as for me, and it's easy for me to say because everybody's view is different, but if they're just operational in nature, I don't think we get in trouble with that.
gotcha.
I agree, but I don't think it's bad also to say, hey, part of this consent agenda is we're hiring both classified and licensed personnel. I mean, just so the general public knows what's
And you
going
might even
on.
say hiring 10 new classified personnel and 12, and just to enumerate a little bit of what we got going on. We don't have to list them by name.
No,
Well, but that's up to us, because we're the one discussing it and
right,
we'll vote, right? And so we can just make those comments or call those things out as the item comes up.
okay. I just, to me, it's more, the more the public can understand what's going on, the better. So that I get me, like, if I'm watching the meeting and I go, oh, they're hiring 10 classified and 10 licensed, that makes sense. That's great, I think that's a positive.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the consent agenda. I'd rather see, item E, E1, E2, E3, E4, E5.
When
And
it's
just
yeah.
vote them kind of as we
When it's
usually.
routine business, it's pretty quick.
Yeah,
I mean, there's not a lot of objection, it's just making sure that people understand what we're doing.
Okay, I think I got the example well enough, and Chris and I can work on that.
I hear a motion to adjourn.
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
In a second.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We adjourn at 7:58.